I think the more we stop relying on our enemies, the government, big tech, the lying harlot media, I think the more effective we will be. But that's not to say we shouldn't use them for the kingdom's maximum benefit while ever that window of opportunity is open.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Daily Declaration podcast. My name is Cody Mitchell, and today I had the privilege of talking to Dave Pellowe. Dave Pellowe is a Christian conservative writer and commentator, editor of theGoodSauce, and convener of the annual Church and State Summit. He believes in natural laws and freedoms, objective truth and justice, personal responsibility and voluntary charity, strong nations and families, free markets, and small government. Dave's show, Pellowe Talk, offers honest insights on important public issues and ideas, as well as informative long-form interviews with experts and insiders. Many of Dave's articles are syndicated across Australia and New Zealand. Dave's an expert in digital media, and so I wanted to get his thoughts on digital media, social media, legacy media, and how Christians can navigate the increasingly complex world of news and media. I hope you enjoy. Dave, thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure, Cody. Thanks for the invitation.
It was my pleasure. You're a guy who works in digital media. It's kind of, you live and breathe that space. I just want to begin by asking you a pretty general question. Digital media is obviously a pretty powerful tool of communication. Why do you think that is? Like, what is it that makes digital marketing so powerful?
Throughout history, there's been the wrestle between the general public and the state. The control of information is the control of minds and the control of power. And centuries ago, newspapers were the journalists who would ask the questions, tell the truth, and hold people in power to account. And then the people in power figured out how to get control and influence over the newspapers. And that was prior to World War I. Fake news is a century old, at least, although the phrase was only coined recently. And today you've got television media, broadcast media, where governments, the biggest portion of news media revenue comes from government advertising. And so without particularly, no conspiracy or anything actually happening, you have the threat of withdrawing that advertising revenue from any particular station that is, too dissonant to the narrative of the day, to the status quo, and that's really significant, especially at election time, which is when we need the most truth from media. And so what digital media has done, again, is essentially re-implement that era where the control of information was taken away from those people in power and given back to the broadest grassroots audience possible, and yet we've seen big tech now become corrupted and influenced by that as well, so that truth and narratives are perverted, and you've got concepts such as hate speech, which is really just newspeak for approved speech and approved opinions. The most salient recent example that everybody should be aware of is the Hunter Biden laptop fiasco, where one of the candidates for the presidency, or one of the two candidates for the presidency of America, was absolutely implicated in the corruption and criminality of the behavior of his son, in such a way that the media interests who really wanted one of the candidates and not the other totally killed the story. They called it fake news. It was censored off the one journal outlet that reported it, the New York Post, had their account shut down, and they weren't allowed to print and publish the facts and the truth. And some year or so later, the New York Times, a former newspaper, came out and said, you know what, that was a legitimate story and the facts were legitimate. But the people, the voters, were deprived the opportunity to properly ventilate the facts of the pros and cons of each candidate prior to an election, which is an absolute rigging of the election using legitimate means. They just stack the deck in their favour. And so digital media, again, has been taken over in such a way that we now have to constantly figure out and reinvent this cat and mouse game of how do we democratize the facts, the news, the truth. And that's increasingly hard and frustrating. And in anticipation of the question, how do we do it? How do we beat the censors? I think newsletters remain the most reliable, independent digital media, not any social media platform, not any of them. And you know what? I think we actually have to forget about digital media or plan ahead for the day when digital media is totally circumvented and go back to Christian communities, churches, letters between churches, and networks of 100 or maybe 1,000 people who are in relationship with each other, and knowing the trustworthy source. I mean, who hasn't got a text message or a Facebook message, and this is from a trusted friend, and it's complete bunkum. Something about some evangelist or apostle who wants us to pray for some Christians who are under attack in some nation where Christians are persecuted, and you find out at best it's true 5 years ago, if true at all. But this friend of a friend stuff is something we have to be wiser consumers of. And when digital media becomes exhausted as a free and liberated information system, we're going to have to go back to the drawing board and communities and relationships, not from an anonymous trusted friend, but from the apostle such and such to the church in such and such. That'll be, I guess, one of the methods we have to think back in advance to is how do we actually secure reliable sources of information and then disseminate them as efficiently and reliably as we can.
Wow, that's really interesting. I find it interesting how digital media has evolved from being kind of this free alternative to the legacy media to almost now being itself what the legacy media used to be. You've coined this phrase, the lying harlot media. Could you explain that for us a little bit?
Yeah, look, it sounds hyperbolic, but I mean it as sincerely as possible. And it's fair to say that for over a century, there has been collusion and coordination in narratives and headlines and editorial focus from mainstream media outlets. At the very best, giving them the most credit possible, you could have called it bias. And no human doesn't bring bias to a story, but the more honest people will admit their bias. At the bottom of every article I publish, even if it's out and out commentary and opinion, and in a category called opinion, I still put the author's bio underneath with details about their background, their leanings, their training, their qualifications, not just for credibility, but also for context. What kind of biases does this writer bring to this topic? So the reader can weigh that as they assess. But I feel we reached a observable watershed moment in the 2020 election of the United States president. It was terrible in his first election in 2016. Donald Trump, we're talking about. I think there was something like 50-1 ratio of negative stories in the media about him, or favorable. 50 for every favorable story in the mainstream about Donald Trump, there were 50 favorable stories about Hillary Clinton. And that just doesn't reflect the population. And so it was very obviously that there's a bias and a slant. But I think in 2020, they had nowhere to go. They were at 110% of rage in 2016. And at 2020, if they weren't already there before, certainly by then they crossed that line, that boundary from biased and slanted and partisan to full-on maliciously deceitful. They just would publish headlines that were irrelevant. They would ignore headlines that were incredibly relevant. They would, the Russian dossier, so that has been so thoroughly debunked and so thoroughly debunked beyond any question that was a Democrat FBI conspiracy trying to, slam Donald Trump. But it's still taken as gospel by people who believe the mainstream media as some kind of infallible source. They have thoroughly crossed a line from biased and partisan to maliciously deceitful. And that's why I call them the lying media. The harlot media, I wanted a strong word, but not as strong as some, not too strong a word. There were stronger words for harlot that I wanted to use. But I think harlot is kind of biblical as well. So I felt that was appropriate. And the reason harlot, I think, is not hyperbolic, but sincerely justifiable and provable, is that the mainstream media, or the journalism in general, is sometimes called the fourth estate. And what its purpose is to be almost like a branch of government, not constitutional and not regulated by anything other than to be honest. And you've got the legislature, you've got the executive, and you've got the judiciary, and the fourth estate is again meant to be that holding the feet to the flames of those people in power to say you're not going to get away unscrutinized. And there is a faithfulness and an integrity that is incumbent upon that job. Just like a judiciary has to be faithful to the Constitution, and elected representatives have to be faithful to their conscience and to God, and I guess we all have to do that, but to the people that voted them, and their accountability is the next election. But the media's job, the journalist and reporter's job, is faithfulness to their audience, to their readers, and to the truth. Faithfulness to the truth above all else. Now, their harlotry comes in their unfaithfulness, with obvious marriage metaphors, that they adulterate the truth, and they do so for compensation. They do so for currency, whether it's their pay packet or career advancement or simple clicks on an internet page. Their absolute exchange of faithfulness and fidelity to the covenant relationship they have with their readers is utterly betrayed and violated in the most filthiest of ways for money. And they deserve zero respect and utter scorn. Those majority of, it's not universal, but the majority of reporters, journalists, and media out there have abandoned that noble calling, once noble calling of the fourth estate, and have become the lying harlot media.
Yeah. No, I think the picture definitely gets across. It's really interesting hearing you break that down, what that means, because you definitely see this increasing, in one sense, I guess, an increasing faithlessness to the truth. But this is something I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on. At the same time, we see this rise in censorship and a crackdown on what certain outlets would consider misinformation. So how do you think the rise of misinformation kind of relates to this idea of truth seeking?
Well, misinformation is these phrases didn't have no meaning prior to the left's weaponization of them, and what they're seeking to do now. Their original meaning is almost irrelevant, because the left are pathologically habitual at undefining words and making them captive to their agenda. And so misinformation and disinformation, whatever they used to mean a year ago, what they mean now is information that's not approved of by leftist narratives and agendas. And that's really sad, because misinformation is a bad thing. Disinformation is a bad thing. Racism is a bad thing. Nazis are a bad thing. All of these phobias, they're bad things. But all of these things have been hijacked, weaponized, and undefined to serve an agenda. And now they mean nothing. Now they just mean an idea or a person that a radical leftist disagrees with vehemently, which is the only way they disagree with anything. But and so misinformation, disinformation, look, if we go back to what they should mean, yes, there is lots of wrong information that's promulgated, I think, fairly equally by both sides of the political spectrum. Sadly, I'm a first-hand witness and observer of the capacity of right-wing conservative Christians for misinformation. We love ourselves an echo chamber. It is really, really sad, and it's something that I hope everybody listening to this actually feels convicted by the Holy Spirit to be cautious of. Just like drunkenness and adultery, we have a faithfulness to truth, surely, if we're Christians. We have an allegiance to truth. And to find an idea which makes us feel better doesn't make it true. If it's an idea that conforms to what we already believe, or even what we think Scripture and God believes, that doesn't necessarily make the source reliable or the facts established. And so we have to make sure that we verify these sources, not forward on messages and share things that are absolute rubbish. We have a responsibility, like the Fourth Estate, to verify the sources and establish the facts before we share it as if true. The fact that somebody we trust publishes it should not be enough for us. Now, I add a caveat to that there are some people, and very few people, not your 50 close friends from home group, but the kind of apostolic level that the New Testament, the confidence that they had in Paul, I think we can have that in some of our Christian leaders today. And that's not to elevate them to the position of Paul or any of the apostles or foundational gospel truths. It's just to say that through relationship, we can have a handful of people who probably perform the function that an old-fashioned journalist used to have. And that is that if they wrote, and you might have a handful, a small number of journalists today that you trust to still tell the truth and be integrous. So off the top of my head, I can think of Miranda Devine, Greg Sheridan, and I won't try and be exhaustive with it, but these are a couple of mainstream journalists who I would trust that if they said it, I'm certain that I can repeat it with confidence, knowing that they are rigorous and integrous about the way they present and research information before they present it. And so, there is that kind of caveat to the fact that we have to fact check everything ourselves. But for sure, 99% of the stuff on Facebook isn't coming from people like them, and there's a whole bunch of, especially around election time, so many theories and allegations and conjectures going on about why we lost, for example. And it's just unhelpful because we're not actually being honest with ourselves. And when we're not honest with ourselves, we're depriving each other of the opportunity to do better. And Proverbs, I think 17 says, wounds from a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses. I don't want false affection from somebody who hates me. I would much rather correction and being told I'm wrong from somebody who I trust to love me and is motivated with sincerity and my best intentions at heart. And so for that reason, we have to demolish right-wing echo chambers as well as we're trying to demolish left-wing echo chambers. We're easy to accuse others of it, but I think we need that kind of integrity and self-assessment for ourselves. I've actually forgotten the question you've asked. I hope I haven't gone off too deep on a rabbit trail.
No, that's actually really good. I love your point about relationship, because the way to tackle misinformation, in my view anyway, is to build relationships and have conversations with people and expose the facts.
Yep.
and debate them robustly, rather than the rise of censorship. Yep. Is this attempt to just, I guess, someone right up, the top of the power hierarchy decides that something is not true, and then they just quash all dissent.
Yep. Now, somebody that I would probably point to, nice and close to home for you, is Kurt Malberg. If he writes anything, I know he is going to be sober in his judgment and commentary and opinion. He's going to be balanced, mature, and wise, and that he brings a professional integrity to his communication of information. So he will often provide his references and sources as well. But anything written by Kurt Malberg, I would have a high degree of confidence in. But certainly in the last 2 years, through COVID lockdown and all these atrociously authoritarian policies from government, there's been opportunity for lots of hyperventilating right-wing conservative commentators who are 100% on the side of freedom and liberty to pop up and get an instant rent-a-crowd from just saying what the Bible calls ear-tickling communication. It just tickles our ears. It confirms the things that we believe already, and we share it crazily. And they are not sober. There's lots of new people who are not sober, and their audiences will disappear as quickly as the authoritarianism does. Hopefully, the authoritarianism disappears quickly. And maybe some of them will actually mature through this process and develop less sensationalism. But I'm looking for sobriety as well as integrity in the people that I'm listening to and repeating and sharing.
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree with your point about echo chambers and how we are, as Christians, can be just as capable of forming those echo chambers. I do want to get to that at some point during our conversation, just this idea of breaking down barriers, particularly in the digital world, but also in real life. But before I do, I would just love to get your thought, and this kind of links in with some of the stuff you've already been saying. Get your thoughts on some best practice for consuming. I mean, maybe it's your view that we shouldn't consume any legacy media, but say in the event that we do, would there be best practice, sort of some advice that you can give people for how not to buy the lies that the lying harlot media are putting forth?
Look, best practice. It's real easy to say don't, and I hope that through theGoodSauce, actually, I'll be able to provide an alternative source in time to come, so that people can turn off the 6 o'clock news. Having said that, I do watch it, and that's partly professional, and partly just to keep my finger on the pulse. It might be because I don't feel there is another quick way. I probably won't watch any more than the first 10 to 20 minutes. I don't want to sit through the whole hour of it all. There's much better things to stream, but it's more because I just want to see what is in the news right now. Not that that's all of the information. For example, Hunter Biden laptop would never have made the 6 o'clock news, but I know when I consume the 6 o'clock news, it's going to come with an agenda, and so everything I hear, I filter. There are some personalities that are less gag-worthy than others, and so I guess I watch the least objectionable ones. And look, I actually think it's getting harder and harder to give the 6 o'clock news any credit at all. What I guess I do want to say is it is important to keep considering the ideas and arguments of people who disagree with us, people who hate God. Sometimes it's about the fact that there are some sincere people who are sincerely wrong, and to listen to the possible criticisms of our own arguments, where areas where we need to either find error and facts that we're not aware of so that we can improve, or even just areas so that it might not say, hey, I'm corrected now because David Koch said so. It might be, David Koch has challenged me on this, and now I need to do more research. One of the things I love about arguing on social media is when it provokes me to dig deeper into God's word, because somebody's challenged me and they've come up with a question that's really good and I don't know the answer to, even though I'm sure they're wrong. I don't know how to answer it. So I'll go and do some study and I'll go and do some research. I'm not corrected by this God mocker, but it does drive me to find either confirmation or correction in further research. So You could almost call it opposition research when you listen to the lying harlot media. What are they saying? Now, one of the things that's really great about that is if you want to advance to not just being informed, but being effective and influential, salt and light in these debates that are going on and holding your own, one of the things you need to do is understand your opponent's argument better than they do. And so there's lots of people who are regurgitating the mainstream media with zero understanding. It's really easy to have a conversation with them when you know more about their point of view. For example, feminism, utterly toxic ideology. And people will come up with trite little slogans that they've heard and they have no depth of understanding. Oh, like the first wave feminists were really good because they were all about equality and voting. Yeah, well, the first wave feminists in Ireland were the first terrorists in Ireland. Some 57 years before the IRA. No, first wave feminine wasn't all sunshine and Skittles. And without getting into that topic, most people won't know that. And so when you do understand their arguments better than they do, you know the answers before they've even raised the objection, and you can lead them to truth. And for the record, I'm all for justice, and that's a Christian principle. We don't need an ism to identify with. We identify with Christ if you're a believer in Jesus, and his justice is the same for everybody. He does not like lying scales or unfair measures. And so, yeah, absolutely, I want the same justice for everybody, regardless of identity. That's for the record on that topic. But to become a wise consumer of mainstream media, the lying harlot media, first understand that they're not serving truth. They're serving a paycheck, sponsors. They have narratives and agendas. And don't let it be the final word. Get a diversity in your diet of information, and be just as, maybe not just as, because right wing or Christian media is going to be coming with a much better agenda and motivation than the lying harlot media. But you still need to check everything. I mean, this shouldn't be controversial. I think every good preacher and pastor I've ever heard will encourage the congregation to go and read this for yourselves when you get home. Go pick up your Bible and do this study yourself. Don't just believe me in the pulpit. Go and check it out for yourselves. And so that's just a really great habit to have with our media and certainly with our government. So many pastors this past 2 years have said, trust the government. And I don't know why they say that when they wouldn't say that about themselves. They want people to go and check out this information for themselves. But they're not willing to ask people to check out what the government says for themselves. That contradiction just is something we have to be a little bit more objective about.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's really helpful. You mentioned social media. I just thought I'd shift gears quickly and look at social media, which is an entirely different beast in some ways. But it can also be pretty easy to fall into the trap of thinking that social media is this just free kind of, totally non-lying harlot style platform. What are some of the dangers that you see in Christians engaging with social media platforms?
The dangers are the algorithms continue to feed us what we've interacted with previously, and we don't get a reality check or the acoustic dampening to the echo chamber. We don't get the accountability for the information that we've been presented. And I've seen some quite high-profile right-wing freedom advocates say some appallingly stupid things, and it's because they're not sober. But if you're not getting a diversity in your diet, if you're not approaching that information critically, you might believe that person because they've got 100,000 followers and take it as gospel and repeat it, and it's a lie, and it's just not true. I criticised a right-wing independent Senate candidate in Queensland. I actually placed him beneath Labor in my published list of people how I would vote. in the second last election, whatever it was, 2019 election. And people accused me of getting my information from the ABC. There's a whole bunch of my followers just started jumping down my throat because I said, this right-wing guy who 99% of the time says what you believe and want to hear, he's worse than Labor. Now, I would have hoped that my audience would know me better than to think I was regurgitating the ABC. And the reason they were so triggered by that, so many of them, not isolated numbers, so many of my audience were so triggered by me disrespecting a right-wing Christian-sounding candidate that they just assumed I was regurgitating leftist propaganda. And the irony is it was them who was impervious to any kind of information which was dissonant or jarring with what they wanted to believe or already believed. Now, I had a combination of public sources and private ones that I couldn't disclose, which enabled me to reach that conclusion. And none of them were the ABC. But, you know, I've been in the background of this scene for a long time. And that particular senator seeking re-election, I'd had an hour face-to-face with meeting prior to him getting any profile at all, because he wanted the platform at the Church and State Summit. And I have to be extremely careful who I give a platform to. And I didn't have anything against him at that time, which I decided against letting him have the platform. But the point is that I had a relationship with this guy. I had far better sources than the ABC. And so in consuming social media, the danger is we build an echo chamber. That we want to like somebody like this or some other story, fact or agenda or theory that's put out there, some story, and we want it to be true. We want the good guy to be on our side because he's against our enemies. And whatever reasons, the danger is that we stop having ears to hear and we only look for evidence to confirm our existing position instead of very fairly weighing every piece of information that comes across the desk. The danger is that social media becomes entertaining for us and not due diligence. And yeah, it's in the mix there with food photos and cat videos. But we have to, especially if we're going to assert an opinion, indignation, or get triggered by something, we have to be sure that the sources we've got are reliable and unimpeachable, and our position is as true as possible before we start attacking. It's much better to be a lot slower. I think, just to summarize, the average consumer of social media has a lot of maturing to do in their consumption habits and information processing before they can become confident in what they're repeating. And maybe it's just that the mature people are all the silent ones, and I'd encourage them to speak up. We do need to be salt and light and bring balance to the conversation, but we just have to be like the men of Issachar and really understand the times that we're in, and just be wise and deliberate about the way that we participate in that, because going off and missing the target is worse than silence.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the natural question at this point is there a way we can beat the algorithm? If not, is there a way we can use the algorithm to become an opportunity of some kind on social media?
The way to beat the algorithm is to not rely on the algorithm. So the algorithm basically takes your past browsing habits and then any little biases they program in that they want to show you more of. But in essence, what it does is it predicts the kind of information you are likely to interact with and enjoy, and show you more of that and less of the stuff that you don't interact with. Now, strangely, recently I've been seeing heaps of stuff as if I'm a leftist in my Facebook page. Heaps of feminism stuff and just new age rubbish and pro-democrat rubbish, and it's really interesting, and I kind of don't mind it, because it's that opposition research, and it's stuff I don't usually see, and so I'm kind of glad to see it. But when it comes to hearing the sources you want to hear, and trying to dodge the algorithm which penalizes truth, Christianity, conservatism, the way to dodge it is to actually use the system that's built in. So make sure you get notifications, or set your highest follow subscription like settings possible. So YouTube, Facebook, they've got different ways, but on Facebook, for example, you've got your news feed and it's just follow, and then you've got a list of favorites, and then you've got a list of see first, or one might even be don't see. But you want the highest possible setting. Like every time this person posts, show me. You can always turn it down if it's too much, but the reality is if you've got 50 to 100 people that you want to follow closely, that kind of supersedes the algorithm. Now, the obvious best way is to subscribe to their newsletters and get it direct to your inbox, so you're not relying on the algorithm altogether. But that's not really you know beating the algorithm. It's more like circumventing it and turning it off altogether. But at the same time, it is good to follow some of those pages that you disagree with. If you can tolerate, if it just wrecks your day, promote your piece. Just follow your piece there, and don't listen to stuff that's going to stress you out before you've even started your day. But yeah, that's probably the best 2 tips. Follow their email, sign up, make sure you get stuff directly to your newsletter, and to your inbox, your email inbox. And then the second one is click the notification settings as intrusive as possible. Make them your highest level of notification. So whenever they post on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, you're getting a notification in the way that you prefer.
Brilliant. That's awesome. Okay, so alternative media. This would be a way, I guess, of bypassing, to a degree, both social media and legacy media. You pretty well work in alternative media. I kind of do as well. What are the benefits of people turning to alternative media outlets?
Well, the benefits are you're diluting the effect of the lying harlot media. Their purchase power, their broadcast reach, their budgets, they're all very, very powerful enemies that we can't match muscle for muscle, pound for pound. So the alternative, at the very least, is diluting that poison. And the human body can tolerate poison in small doses. We can process it. That's why immunizations, the same immunization, will be very different on a 100-kilo man to a 2-kilo child, because there's just so much more muscle to process the foreign substances which have been put into that body. So it's the same with lying harlot media. There's an element of foreign unhealthy material that's coming into our mind and into our information diet, and what we need to do is be able to dilute its effect and spread it across a broader range of information. And so alternate is a really great word. Independent is another really great word. It's just independent media. And I think sometimes you could almost call the mainstream media bloggers, because there's so much information and it's like journaling their Dear Diary thoughts, as opposed to facts and information. And so getting a whole lot of other bloggers who are, happily calling themselves that, just helps balance out your diet. You don't want all meat in your diet. You don't want all ice cream in your diet. You don't want all cereal. You need a good, rounded, balanced source of nutrition. So the same with information. And again, don't just listen to one source. You've got theGoodSauce, you've got Cauldron Pool, you've got George Christensen's newsletter, you've got Canberra Declaration. There's a bunch of different alternate media outlets, which are really, really great for providing balance. They'll have different interests. I myself hate writing about what everybody else is writing about and talking about what everybody else is talking about. I've got an interview one-on-one with Senator Malcolm Roberts this Friday night. We're going to be doing an outdoor video recording over a fire pit, and it'll be a good hour-long chat. And I'm really thinking about, what do I talk to him about? Because I don't want to talk to him about what everybody talks to him about. I want it to be unique and really interesting and engaging, because people haven't seen it before. And so that's why you won't get that conversation on any of the other platforms. But what's on the other platforms is still interesting and necessary information. So, building that diversity is what alternate media can do, to the point, I believe, that you actually can maintain more than enough information without ever listening to mainstream media ever again. I think there's enough out there already. If you're proactive and go get it and bring it in, it's not going to be, at the end of your TV remote at 6 o'clock when you sit down for dinner. But it could be on your, the ability to stream or cast what you're streaming to your phone, to your family TV now is really great. And that has enabled us like never before to get the information, even from a website where you're not even relying on algorithms. You just go to that website to get it, and then you can share that video. That's what I do on my website. Everything's now embedded not from YouTube, but from Rumble. So I know the videos are never going to be taken down. And instead of having to go through the Rumble algorithms, you can go straight to the GoodSauce website, and you can stream whatever content you want straight to your TV or your other device whenever you want. So alternate media has become incredibly powerful, especially when we're not relying on social media to get our alternate media.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's awesome. You've kind of been touching on it throughout the course of this conversation, but I thought I'll give you the opportunity to sum up how ecosystems, we kind of naturally fall into them, whether it be in real life or on social media. How can we break down that divide? How can we reach across that sort of information and ecosystem divide and build relationships with people who are different from us?
I often get asked similar things about starting new things, and I've kind of rephrased your question a little bit, because my answer to your question is there's nothing that beats God's original plan, and that is human relationships, human communities, and specifically the church. The church I go to, they say the service is now finished and church starts out in the cafeteria. We're having morning tea. This time of fellowship, that's church. Church is everything perhaps but that 90 minutes or 2 hours. And of course that's not true. That's church as well, and very important, indispensable part. But the point is there needs to be a re-emphasis on community and relationships and outreach, which results in relationships. There's lots of churches that do charity in the government welfare sense of the word, and it doesn't result in relationship and evangelism. And I just want to encourage the church to refocus there. And one of the things that I guess grieves me is there's a lot of Christian parents who can't afford Christian schooling, because it's become the elite, expensive option. Very necessary, very beneficial. But when we started Christian education, it was for the non-Christians, it was for the poor, and it was completely free. And the reason we did that was to bring people into the kingdom of God. We wanted people literate in an age where education wasn't compulsory, let alone government funded and provided. And so the church said, forget user pays. We're actually going to pay for this and make sure that every single citizen within our reach, especially the poor and external to this body of believers, we're going to make sure they're literate, at least literate, so that they can read the Bible. And government started getting interested in that. There was a piece of legislation, the first legislation to make education compulsory in the state of Massachusetts in America, was called Ye Old Deluder Satan Act. And they sought to make education compulsory, and there was a tax to make sure every citizen in the towns or cities would actually fund for the education of everybody else, to get them at least to the stage that they could read the Bible. And the purpose was so that they would not be deluded by Satan. And that makes for a better community, better city, better nation, better society. And so breaking down the divides and how to overcome the different ecosystems where we're getting this information and then other people aren't, I think is through relationship. And we have to be innovative about it, and at the same time reflective. What worked for the New Testament church, what worked for the historical church since then, when they didn't have these digital communications. And I think the more we stop relying on our enemies, the government, big tech, the lying harlot media, the more we stop relying on them and looking for innovative solutions outside of them, I think the more effective we will be. But that's not to say we shouldn't use them for the kingdom's maximum benefit while ever that window of opportunity is open.
Yeah, I love that. That's really good. And the church, I guess, has an excellent vehicle to be building those relationships in that community and thinking radically and outside the box to build those relationships. Yeah. That's fantastic. Just before we finish up, I thought I'd grill you a little bit about a couple of your sort of media projects that you're working on at the moment. One that I think is relatively recent is Locke Press, and this is one that really interests me. Could you tell us a little bit about where that came from?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that I see as a problem in modern Christianity, if not more broadly conservatism generally, is the lack of funds that we have. You have massive millionaires and $1 million budgets going into radical leftist campaigns, which are entirely anti-God, anti-church, anti-family, and anti-individual. And yet it's very hard to sustain a career as a Christian thinker or as a conservative thinker. And so what Locke Press is one of those initiatives designed to put more money back into the pocket of right-thinking publishers, right-thinking authors. And self-publishing is the way to do that, as opposed to when you publish through a conventional publisher, you get a third or less of the royalties, of the profits from every book. The publisher will essentially buy the intellectual property from you and give you a trailing commission on every sale thereafter. And bookshops get the largest portion of that. The publisher obviously gets a large portion of that because they've invested upfront for the printing costs, the editing, the formatting, cover design, the services needed to register the ISBN and get it into wholesale and distributor lists throughout Australia. The publisher deserves their fair share because they're essentially taking all the risk, other than the time it took the author to write the piece. What Locke Press seeks to do is essentially provide a service for self-publishing. And so the author is essentially their own investor. They will pay for the printing and the development costs. And that's around $2,000 for anybody thinking about doing it. It's not prohibitively expensive, but it's also not going to come out of your weekly budget. There's a small investment there. And then they have the option in negotiation with me, depending on how much risk I want to take. They could just pay a fee for service, where essentially I'm like a marketing company, web development, and I just navigate the entire system for them like a consultant. So they don't need to be an expert in publishing or self-publishing, but they still get that that reach and that final finished product to a professional standard. Now, depending on the book and my appetite on what I think it's going to do, I may actually invest my costs for a share of the profits as well. And so either way, they're going to be making more than they would if they went through a publisher, because they're investing a little bit more. And so there's a little bit of risk there from them. But, if it doesn't need to sell 1,000 copies for them to break even on that cost normally. So if you can sell 1,000 copies of the book, it's far less than 1,000 actually, might be depending on the size and various individual traits of the book. It's far less than 1,000. So it doesn't need to be a bestseller. Now, the other benefit that I bring that particular set of authors is that we've got a great network of that niche market, conservatives and Christians, that we can reach tens of thousands of conservatives and Christians with the opportunity to actually see that book and understand that it exists. And then something else I do is, rather than paying bookshops to sell the book and give them the large portion of profits that bookshops can make, we'll actually take that to some various conservative newsletters and Christian mailing lists and use it as a fundraising opportunity for them. So, for example, you might see Bill Muhlenberg advertise a book from Locke Press. And when he does, a generous portion of that sale that a bookshop would normally get will go into Bill Muhlenberg Ministries, helping sustain not only the Christian conservative author who wrote that book, but it will actually support Bill Muhlenberg's ongoing writing and thought leadership as well. So I actually am really, really stoked with it, because it is an opportunity to just, with a service, with a genuine product, not just asking for donations, actually putting money back into the sustainability of Christian and conservative thinking in Australia.
Yeah, and that's super exciting. Now, I know I've taken up more than enough of your time, but theGoodSauce is your other ministry, and that's been going for a while now. Can you tell us a little bit, you've mentioned already, a little bit about what you do there?
Yep. So what theGoodSauce is the first platform in Australia to go beyond articles and host multiple content creators in video and podcast. And the theory there, or the philosophy there, was to support the ongoing work and make it sustainable. So I was doing my own blog fairly well and successfully, had a great mailing list, was being published on a bunch of different article-only platforms. But I really wanted to reach those people who don't read articles. They listen to podcasts, they watch YouTube, but they're just not readers. And I didn't just want to do that by myself, but I actually wanted to bring people along like Mark Powell, James McPherson, George Christensen, Professor David Flint, Alexandra Marshall, Lyle Shelton. And so a whole bunch of different people over the time have done a show for either a limited season or ongoing, still doing it. And that's really the vision of theGoodSauce, is to take multiple independent right thinkers from around Australia, not limited to Christians, and a place where we can have a contest of ideas. I love it when people disagree with me on that platform. And there's different denominations, and there's atheists, completely secular topics, and writers. It's great because we actually get to bounce off each other. And instead of me just saying the evidence for scriptural authority and the historicity of Jesus is established and well known, I've got an atheist pushing back and arguing with me, and it's just as good as having the audience there, because you get a fuller, more complete explanation and interrogation of these topics. And that is what the mainstream media lack, is this courage and willingness to court controversy and have hard debates, and risk an idea that they don't approve of prevailing. And that's the worst thing about authoritarianism, is that somebody might make a different decision than the one the authoritarian wants them to. And of course, that's the freedom we have in Jesus Christ, to actually reach our own conclusions and be wrong. And our objective is to not be wrong, but to pursue truth. And the best way to do that is mutually, without ego or pride, but an honest commitment to discovering and promoting the truth of any given topic, issue, or debate.
Awesome. That's really, really exciting. And I encourage everyone to check out Dave's projects. I'll include links to them in the description. Thanks, Dave. It's been really good talking to you.
Well, for everybody who's still listening, make sure you head along to Church and State conference in Moree on the 20th of August. But head to churchandstate.com.au. You'll be able to find those conferences going along there, which are Christian voter education, essentially, trying to help Christians become better informed and better involved in influencing the nation. We'll be going to Adelaide before the end of the year as well. So keep checking out churchandstate.com.au for that information, but churchandstate.com.au/Moree for that date coming up on the 20th of August.
Awesome. Yeah, and I look forward to hosting Dave and a few other really excellent speakers here in Moree in just a few weeks now. Thanks again, Dave. We'll appreciate your time.
Thanks, Cody. Great chatting.